Here's the recording of pages 99 to 102 in the Human Odyssey. We are in chapter 8, The Spread of Civilization, Egypt. While Sumerians built the first ziggurats along the Euphrates River, Egyptians were building a civilization of their own on the banks of the Nile River in northeast Africa, right here. Ruled by kings who claimed to be gods, the Egyptians accomplished astonishing feats. They built gigantic pyramids that dazzle us still. They recorded their lives in elaborate picture writing. They pondered life after death, preserving the bodies of their dead as mummies and preparing them to journey into the afterlife. The Egyptians were the second of the great ancient civilizations. Their culture flourished for more than 3,000 years, making it one of the longest lived civilizations in all of history. The gift of the Nile. In ancient Egypt, everything began and ended with the mighty Nile, the longest river in the world. Look at a map and you'll see it spilling out of Central Africa and heading north for 4,000 miles to the Mediterranean Sea. For the last 600 miles, it runs through the flat plains that were once ancient Egypt. At its mouth, it breaks into several channels and gives birth to a broad, marshy delta where the river flows into the sea. Almost all of Egypt is desert, a dry, brown-red land where life struggles for a foothold. The Egyptians themselves called the forbidding desert desert, which meant red land. But if you could fly over those barren stretches of desert in an airplane and look down at Egypt, you would see what looks like a thin green ribbon lying on a red-brown paper package. That green ribbon is the Nile River Valley. In some places, it is 10 or 12 miles wide. In a few places, it shrinks to almost nothing. On that thin stretch of land alongside the river, ancient Egypt flourished. Every year by late July, a month after the rainy season began in Central Africa, huge amounts of water coursed down the Nile. As rains swelled the river, the Nile began to overflow its banks, flooding the parched length of land. This was usually a gentle rise, not as violent as the flooding along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. For several weeks, the Nile would cover the land with muddy water. Then, when the river receded again in September, it left behind a strip-rich black soil several miles wide on either side. The Egyptians called their country Kemet, which meant black land, after this dark, silty soil. Here, on this long strip of land, hugged the Nile, they learned to till the land with a hoe and to plant and harvest crops. Like the Sumerians, the Egyptians learned to take advantage of their river home. Since there was almost no rainfall in their land, they had to find a way to use the Nile's life-giving waters. Over the centuries, Egyptians harnessed the floodwaters of the Nile for irrigation. They learned to channel the precious waters to holes called catchment basins, rationing it to their fields when needed. They also used the ox-drawn plow, which helped them till their fields. And there's a picture of the ox-drawn plow. And then right over here it says a river delta. A delta is a triangular piece of land at the mouth of a river. It's usually laden with rich deposits of alluvial soil, that is, soil deposited by flowing water. The term delta comes from the fourth letter of the Greek alphabet, which looks like this. In the rich black soil, the Egyptians grew wheat for their bread and barley for their beer. Cattle, sheep, and goats fed on the cereal chaff. All kinds of crops flourished: onions, beans, lentils, dates, figs, grapes, pomegranates, and flax to make linen. Over time, farmers began to produce the surplus of food needed for civilization. And along the Nile's banks grew reeds, which, as we'll soon see, the Egyptians used to make into their version of paper. The Nile was also a roadway the Egyptians used for travel and trade between the villages that sprang up along the river banks. Eventually, all kinds of boats and barges plied the river, from small skiffs made of reeds to large wooden boats powered by many oars. By 3200 BC, the Egyptians had learned to make sailboats and began to send trading vessels across the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. As time passed, a few villages grew into cities. Early on, Memphis, the Egyptian capital, became a major center of trade. Egypt had many of the same trading partners as ancient Sumer. There were few trees for timber in Egypt, so ships brought cedar and juniper from what is today Lebanon. The Egyptians imported silver and later horses from Syria. They loved jewelry and were partial to the richly veined deep blue stone called lapis lazuli. This stone came from a land far to the east, an area now known as Afghanistan. From lands to the south in Africa, the river trade brought ebony, copper, cattle, gold, ivory, incense, and ostrich feathers. First, let's take a look at this map right here. So here's the Nile River Valley around 2500. So here's the Mediterranean Sea, here's the Red Sea, here's the Delta, and then here is the Nile River. Okay, and these are the different cities along the way. And as you can see, there's deserts all around. And then Memphis was the capital. So upper and lower. Look at the map and you'll see that the lower Egypt is up near the Nile Delta. Why is that? Because the part of a river nearest the sea is called the lower part of the river. The sources of the Nile River, where the river begins, are in the mountains of Central and East Africa. That's the upper Nile. Then it flows north through Egypt and empties into the Mediterranean Sea. That's the lower part. No, the part nearest the sea. Okay. So, surplus grain, stone for building, copper for tools, semi-precious stones for jewelry, all moved up and down the Nile. Life-giving water, fertile soil, a surplus of food, an avenue for trade, a home for villages and cities, the Nile provided all of these things for the Egyptians who built their civilization along its banks. No wonder the Greek historian Herodotus called Egypt the gift of the Nile. And that's where the reading stops, but also let's take a look at the map. Early Egyptian trade routes. So these are the routes, trade are in the red, places that they traded and how they got there. That's the end of the reading of pages 99 to 102.